Today we're going to be looking at Colossians 3, 17 through 21, and we're going to be discussing family matters. Now, verses 17 through 21 are actually a part of what we started last week and what we'll study next week. They all tie together. But when you have a portion of passage that deals with family matters, that deals with husbands and wives, God's structure for the home, like we talked about it last week as well for sex, God's design for it is in a loving relationship between husbands and wives. When you have a passage that deals with the home that falls on Valentine's, you have to take advantage of it. So today we're going to look at family matters and what Paul had to say with it. Now in Colossians, Paul has been writing to a church that he's never met, that he's never been to, but he's heard about the problems they're facing, some false teachings that have come in, things that fly in the face of Christianity, that are false distortions. They're distortions of who Christ was and who he is. And Paul takes those on. Now in the first two chapters, he takes it on with theology. He hits on why we believe what we believe. He hits on what the truth is compared to the lies that are being taught. Jesus just isn't some spirit who wandered the earth, who was a step below God, but was good because he was spirit. Jesus was God. He says that you don't get to get closer to Jesus, get closer to God because of how much knowledge you have. It's a heart issue. It's a heart thing. It's a surrendering of ourselves to Christ. Paul deals with this from a theological perspective, and he takes on this group of people. The word means the intelligent ones because they thought intelligence would get them closer to God. Anybody remember what that name of that group is? The Gnostics. Good job. It's the Gnostics. They thought if you had enough of their knowledge, then you were truly spiritual. Paul debates that. He debunks that in the first two chapters. And then starting with last week, he takes the theology and he puts the feet on the ground and he says, here's how you're supposed to live it out. If you believe properly about Christ, this is what it'll look like in your everyday life. We began last week. This week we'll talk about family. Next week we'll look at some bigger social issues that Paul addresses. But today we'll start with Colossians chapter 3. And verse 17. Now, in writing this, Paul starts with, and this has been the theme throughout, that Christ is supreme over everything, every spiritual being, every created thing, every person, over every relationship. Christ is supreme over it. And as Christians, this thought should permeate our world. Christ is supreme over everything that we deal with, every person that we talk to, every relationship that we're in. But let's take it a step further. As a Christ follower, and this is the first blank on your outline, as Christ followers, the supremacy of Christ in the world begins with the supremacy of Christ in our homes. The supremacy of Christ in our world begins with the supremacy of Christ in our homes. This is reflected in our relationship as husbands and wives, as parents, and with our children. Beginning with verse 17. It says, and whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Wives, submit. Husbands, love. Children, obey. Parents, encourage. Now, all four of these are going to be challenging to hear about. So can you just tap the person beside you and tell them, just hang in there. Just hang in there. Don't walk out the door. Listen it all the way through. Just hang in there. Now, I'm going to talk about the first two, husbands and wives. Ryan is going to talk about children and parents. Wives, submit to husbands. Another word here says to yield to them, to prefer them. Wives, submit to, yield to, prefer your husbands. Not women submit to men. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Not men love all women. Husband, love your wife. One paraphrase of this verse says, wives, understand and support your husbands by submitting to them in ways that honor the master, that honor God. Husbands, go all out in your love for your wives. Don't take advantage of them. Wives, submit or yield. Husbands, love. Now, Paul doesn't give us much detail on how, and I don't think his goal here is to be real thorough on step 1, step 2, step 3. We'll see a little bit of that next week, but then from Mother's Day to Father's Day, we're going to do an entire series on the home, on husbands, wives, children, parents, dealing with older parents, children at different ages, being single again. We're going to look at the home as a whole. But today we're going to look at husbands, wives, children, parents. And the heart of this, as it relates to husbands and wives, the heart of what we see Paul say here may not go into a lot of detail, but he challenges both roles. He challenges both husbands and wives to serve each other outside of their comfort zone. Both of these are actually unnatural responses. If you look at sociology, what they'll tell you, sociologists will tell you, is men actually understand pecking order better. We understand if someone is bigger than us, stronger than us, faster than us, they will beat us up. They are the chief, we are the Indian. They are the boss, we are secondary. Men will fall under this. We get this. Watch a movie that's made for a man. It doesn't take a lot of brain cells. It's usually stuff being blown up, stuff being torn up, someone being beat down, and in the end, there's one man who stands triumphantly over all others, and all the other men are like, we're not worthy. We get that. We understand. So it makes sense for us to say, we honor the big and powerful God of the universe because he can squash us. That's men. We get submission. We get power. But he doesn't tell us to submit. Ladies, love, the emotion especially of love, is a more natural response from a female. Watch a movie that's made for a female. There's usually far less blowing up. There's a lot more hugs. There's a lot more relationship. It usually ends with tears, hugs, I love yous, and a box of Kleenex. It's very different. But he doesn't tell women to love. What does he say? He says, husbands, love. Wives, submit or yield. Herbert Carson, he wrote the Tyndale New Testament commentary on this passage. And he said the emphasis of this entire series of relationship in the family is that the responsibilities are reciprocal. If the wife offers obedience, it is in the context of the husband's love. There must be no self-seeking on the husband's part. For Christian love, as exemplified supremely in Christ, is far removed from the mere natural love in that it seeks primarily the good of the beloved, the good of the person you're loving, rather than the satisfaction of self. Wives, submit, yield, prefer. Husbands, love your wife. Ladies, and I know this is an irritating statement, but this isn't the blanks on the outline. Wives, submit to your husbands. This requires a level of vulnerability. It feels very vulnerable to trust someone this implicitly. But this isn't just a trusting of your husband. The question I would ask is, do you trust God with your husband? Do you trust that God can break through to your husband? And if you're married to a Christian man, if you're married to a man who says his heart is given to the Lord, can you trust that he'll listen for the betterment of your family? This can be tough. This can be tough. Now, please know, he is not your God. And you've been married for any amount of time, you already know this. He is not your God. But there's a unique submission. There's a unique place of relationship that wives are called to in yielding to husbands. And I was talking to my wife about this. Gina and I have mentioned this before, 25 years of marriage. And I have never, at any point in our 25 years, felt like my wife was trying to put me under her foot or under her thumb. Not all men can say that. And in the early years, there's always going to be times where something feels naggy or something's not feeling done in time. That's part of marriage. That's part of the challenges that go with the many, 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 many blessings of marriage. And I asked Gina about this. I told her what we were going to be talking about in the subject, and I said, how does this work for you? And she had a lady when we were first married, someone who had been married far more years, give her some advice on this subject, and it's ABC. First is ask. It's the conversation that happens between husbands and wives. And husbands, listen to your wives. You're missing out on a lot of wisdom and blessing for your home if you don't. But it starts with the ask, the conversation that needs to happen. How it's going to affect the bigger picture. And if there's no breakthrough, Gina said the next step, the B, is be quiet. Be quiet and let God speak. And it's amazing how God can break through when the room is silent. Ask, be quiet, and then C is cry out to God. Cry out to God. I'm telling you, God will speak. It's amazing how many times that Gina and I may have debated something and her final response was, okay, fine. And every husband in the room knows what that means. And I end up going back later and going, okay, let's do it that way. And I know in the back of her mind, she's like, I told you. But she doesn't say it. Ask, be quiet, cry out to God. These roles are also spelled out in 1 Peter chapter 3. We're not going to go there this morning, but if you are married, if you are engaged, or if you are considering it, I would ask you, please, this week as homework, go to 1 Peter chapter 3. It talks a little bit more in detail than Paul does here about husbands and wives and the blessing you are to each other, and also the repercussions if we don't order our relationships showing love. Showing submission, as Paul says in another part, one to another. If we don't order our relationship in a godly manner, there are repercussions with that. Wives, submit, yield to, or prefer your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. This requires a level of humility. This is not a beat your chest moment or relationship. This is a humbling call and a responsibility. It is a humbling thing to realize our role in the home. And it's also humbling sometimes showing love, especially when you don't know what the response is going to be. Have you ever seen it played out on a phone call? Wife, fiance, even girlfriend says, tell me you love me. And the guy's going, there's other people around. I'm not going to hang up until you tell me you love me. Now I'll tell you when I see you. Tell me you love me. Don't you love me? Fine. I love you. Blow me a kiss. It plays out and the guy's dying 1,000 deaths. It is a challenging role, but men, we are called to love our wives. Love is preferring them over ourselves. The husband also is warned of the danger of petty tyranny when bitterness or harshness usurps the place of love. We are called to love. And guys, here's the challenge. We are expected to be the portrait of the love of Christ in our homes. We are expected to be the portrait of the love of Christ in our homes. That is a high responsibility and a high calling. Forgiveness as Christ did. Mercy as Christ did. Grace as Christ has. None of us lives in that place. But men, we move toward that, showing love to our wives. Guys, if you're willing to live like this, I can just about guarantee you, you will see a different attitude in your wife. Now, before I turn it over to Ryan, I want to just give you two final points. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, if you are unmarried, if you are engaged, and you do not see these traits in the person you are considering marrying, if you do not see this as a possibility, run the other way. Guys, if you have someone who always has to be in competition with you, always has to put you down, always has to lord over you, run the other way. 50 years is a long time to be in that relationship. Run the other way now. Ladies, if he does not know how to love you, if he does not know how to prefer you, if he does not know how to show you kindness, if love is not there, run the other way. Paul says in another passage that the husband is supposed to be to the wife what Christ was to the church, even to the point of laying his life down for her. If he won't even give up the clicker, he's not going to give up his life. Run the other way. Wives, submit, yield. Prefer your husband. Husbands, love your wives. And remember this, God has made you unique. Men, women, husbands, wives, we bring something different to the table. Men and women are different.
So if you've been in any sort of relationship, especially if you've been married for any amount of time, you get this, that there's this inherent difference between men and women, and that makes family life messy, makes it complicated. Then, all of a sudden, you throw children in the mix, right? These miniature copies of you and your spouse and all of your dysfunction. Throw them in the mix, add a couple of those, and family life can get really, really messy. And God knows that. And Paul knows that. And so he turns from talking about the relationship between men and women, husbands and wives, and he turns to children and parents. Now, you have to understand, at this time in Greco-Roman culture, children didn't have a lot of rights. They could be considered next to property of the male head of the household. Yes, it was true that some social writers, some ethicists at the time had written, it's a good idea to be a good dad. You got to treat your children well. But there wasn't, there weren't social workers, and there wasn't really child protective services, and so parents could really kind of get away with whatever they wanted. There wasn't a whole lot of accountability. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, had sort of given this is how it works, this is how you order your household, this is how families should act, and he never talks to any other members of the family but fathers. He only tells men, this is how you got to order your household. Paul, in his typical fashion, elevates women by addressing them, elevates children by addressing them directly, and he talks to the children. And so, children, I'm just going to talk to you. Parents, you can listen in if you want, that's fine. But children, I'm going to talk to you. This is for you. God has this word for you. Now, you might be sitting out there and you're asking, like, do I count as a child? Some of you are 18, 19, 20, whatever it is, and you're still trying to figure out, am I under my parents' authority? Am I under their household? It would have been a really clear distinction for them back in that time. You went from being a child to being married, and then you were out from under your parents' household. It's a little bit more complicated today. Typically, we think about adulthood as being over 18, yes, but also supporting yourself, right? Being independent from your parents. So if you're wondering if this applies to you, I'd ask you these questions. Who pays for your groceries? Who pays for your insurance? Who pays for your cell phone bill, for your internet, those things? Who is responsible for the car? Those sorts of questions. And if you can't answer that it's you, then maybe you're still under your parents' household. Some of you are over 18, you're legally adults, and yet I would still say you're probably still under your parents' authority, under their household. I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to parse that out for you, those of you I see out there, but I'll let the Spirit of God convict you on whether or not this applies to you. All right, look at verse 20 with me. Chapter 3, verse 20, Paul turns to children. He says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Now, here's where I bust out the Greek, right? And I tell you that obey doesn't actually mean obey, and in everything doesn't actually mean in everything, right? Wrong answer. Sorry, kiddos. Obey, it's really clear. You don't need a master's degree for this one. Obey means listen to what your parents say, hear what they're telling you, and then actually do what they tell you to do. It's that simple. You know how to obey. Now, your gut reaction, especially if you're teenagers, well, what about this? You don't know my parents. What if this? What if that? Okay, I hear you. I work with teenagers. I get it. Let me give you the one exception. Are you ready? Here's the one exception. Children, if your parents ever command you or they ask you to sin against God, if your parents ever tell you to do anything that is rebellion against God, you have my permission, I think you have God's permission to disobey them. Don't do what they tell you to do if they tell you to sin against God. But can we just be honest? That's like 1% of the time, 0.01% of the time. If your parents are Christians, if you're living in a Christian home, and I think this passage is addressed to believing children who are living in the homes of believers. And so, yes, that small percentage of the time, I would say, yeah, don't listen to your parents. But everything else, Paul would say, children, obey your parents. Children, obey your parents. And he could just leave it at that. People would get that. He could say, hey, that's just how society works. That's just how households are supposed to be. He could give another reason. He could say, because they've given you so much. I mean, think of all your parents have done for you. You owe them obedience. Or he could give the age-old expression, maybe you've heard this, because he's your dad and he says so. Or because she's your mom and she says so. Maybe some of us have heard that, right, in our houses. Paul doesn't say that, but he gives a reason. He gives a reason. Why should children obey their parents? He says, children, obey your parents for, this is the reason, for this pleases the Lord. This pleases the Lord. Okay, difficult interpretive question. Who is the Lord in this passage? You guys all have your Sunday school answers ready? Okay, who's the Lord? 3, 2, 1. Jesus. Jesus. Yeah, it's always right in Sunday school, right? Jesus. Jesus is the Lord. So children, this is crazy. Listen to this. Your primary responsibility, your job as children, those under your household, your parents' household, is not primarily to obey your parents. To please your parents. Your job is not primarily to please your parents. That's not the thing you should be most worried about, is pleasing your parents. If you're a follower of Jesus, the thing you should be most worried about is pleasing Jesus. Pleasing Jesus. And you will please Jesus. One of the many ways you can please Jesus is by obeying your parents, by doing what they tell you to do. It says, obey your parents, for this pleases the Lord. Now, some of you might be like, whoa, if that's what it takes to please Jesus, I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I want to buy in to this whole thing, because I don't know if I can obey my parents. Why would I want to please Jesus? Why is he worth pleasing? I think it goes back to the beginning of the letter. This is all part of the same letter, right? And in chapter 1, Paul makes it very clear that Jesus is supreme. That's why we've titled the series Supreme. He talks about Jesus as being the one through whom all authorities, powers, rulers, and dominion was created. Jesus instituted all of those things, all authorities. So, children, who do you think decided that you'd be born into the home that you're in, with the parents that you have, with the rules that they have? Who do you think decided that? It's Jesus. He's supreme. He created all of those things. And so, obeying your parents, children, you're supposed to obey your parents, and that requires trust. It requires trust. It requires trusting that Jesus has put that man and that woman, those people, over you for your good, that your parents are given to you by God as an authority over you, and that's for your good, and you can trust Jesus, and if you desire to please Jesus, you will obey your parents. And this is the tough thing. When you say, no, I don't want to obey my parents, you're saying to Jesus, Jesus, I don't trust you enough to obey my parents, or I don't care enough about pleasing you to do what my parents ask of me. That's what you're saying to Jesus. Obeying Jesus requires trust in him. Obeying your parents requires trust in Jesus. And so some of you are here, and you might disagree with your parents on a number of things going on in your house. You might disagree with what age they allow you to have a cell phone or to have a tablet, or how much time they let you spend on the internet. You might disagree with them about decisions related to schooling. I've heard both since I've gotten to be a part of Spring Lake. I don't want to be homeschooled, or I want to be homeschooled and I'm sick of going to regular school. You might disagree with them on the amount of time you get to play video games, or whatever it is that you do. You might disagree with them on the rules for dating, who you can date, when you can date, what you can do with the person you're dating. I would just ask you, do you trust Jesus enough to obey your parents? Do you care enough about pleasing Jesus to obey your parents? My parents had plenty of rules. There were things we weren't allowed to watch. There were things we weren't allowed to read. I'm not going to give you some of those because some of you would judge my parents for being too strict. Some of you would judge them for being not strict enough. But I'll give you a rule related to dating. We dated in high school, and they had this rule where we weren't allowed to go to the home, be inside the home of our significant other if their parents weren't home, and we weren't allowed to be inside our house if our parents weren't home. We weren't allowed to be home alone with our significant other. And so that made for some awkward situations where we'd end up having to walk around out in the cold if mom and dad weren't home, or go sit on a park bench somewhere, or whatever it was. And I remember mom and dad, you're so frustrating. And I had to come to a place where I had to ask myself, do I trust my parents? Do I trust that they're not just making stuff up, but these rules are for my good? And I would even want to take it to a higher level. Do I trust Jesus? Do I trust Jesus enough that he's put these parents over me for a reason, and do I care about pleasing Jesus enough to obey him? It's more than just this horizontal thing. It's a vertical thing between you and the Lord. So children, obey your parents. And that puts you in a really vulnerable position, right? If you're in a home where your parents don't care about your emotions, if they don't care about what you want and they're harsh with you, children just blindly obeying them, that puts you in a vulnerable position. But Paul knows that, and family matters. Family matters to God. And so Paul doesn't stop there. He turns to parents, and he addresses parents next. Let's look at verse 21 together. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they'll become discouraged. Back in this time, fathers were the head of their household. They were the Lord was the word used, the Lord or the master of their homes. They were kind of the king of their household. And so Paul rightly addresses fathers. And we here at Spring Lake believe that if you're a dad, if you're a male, a man who has children, that you have a unique and a God-given responsibility to be an authority figure in your home, to guide your children, to bring them up in a way that honors the Lord. That's a privileged and responsibility position. But let's be honest, there's a number of families here who there isn't really a dad in the picture, right? So many of us know people like that if that's not our situation. And there's probably many here who there are grandparents and there are uncles and guardians who have really taken the primary parenting responsibility. And so I would say these words apply to you as well. Paul says, do not embitter your children. Other translations say, do not provoke your children. And so what's going on here is Paul is warning against an overuse or an abuse of power. You have God-given power or God-given authority as a parent if you have children, but this is an overuse or an abuse of power. What it might look like today might be making rules upon rules upon rules that don't necessarily have logic tied to them, a good reason, but simply because you want to control your children's behavior. Little kind of a heart test would be ask this question: do you find yourself backing up your decisions, your rules with, because I said so, because I said so, because I said so, or are there good reasons behind the limits you put on your children? Maybe that's just a heart test. It could look like this: a parent, mom or dad, who treats their children like cheap labor, not out of a desire to teach them about hard work or about how to contribute to the family, but out of laziness or selfishness. It could look like this. It could be the mom or dad, the adult, who enforces their will on their child through physical violence or through verbal harassment and berating their child. If you do that, if you know people who are doing that, not only is that sinning against God, but that's provoking your children to rebellion, and it's discouraging them, beating them down, taking away the will to go on. Do not be surprised if that child, when they reach adulthood, leaves, turns their back on you, and wants nothing to do with you anymore because they're discouraged. Now, some of you are like, man, that's not us. I mean, we're not that bad. Okay, so let's level. There are more subtle ways of discouraging your children, aren't there? I've met the kid who had to quit the high school sports team he was a part of because dad was the coach, and dad loved the game, and dad had a hard time separating his love for the game from his love for his kid, and was super critical and always was in a bad mood after games. And this kid's like, I'm done. I'm sick of it. He was discouraged. I've seen the students who are so busted up when they get a B+ because that means they're going to miss the honor roll, and they have to go home and explain to mom and dad, and they're going to be so disappointed with them. And that's everything to them, is how they perform in front of their parents and their grades. They're discouraged. I've seen young men and women go from relationship to relationship to relationship to relationship because dad or mom never told them that they loved them, never said, I love you. And so they go from relationship to relationship trying to get that feeling of love, trying to experience that love. Maybe the most common and the most dangerous in the church is this: young men and women who grow up only ever hearing, I love you, and we're proud of you, and we care about you when they do good things, and only ever hear shame and guilt when they do bad things. How difficult is it to understand the gospel if you've grown up in a home like that? Because the gospel is that when God was most disappointed in you, when he was most disappointed with your sin and rebellion, he expressed his love in the greatest form by sending Jesus to die for you, to die in your place. That is the gospel Do we ever tell our children, buddy, you have messed up, and we're disappointed, but we love you, and we care about you because our love for you is not contingent upon your obedience. I don't love you because you obey me. I love you because you're my kid. I love you because you're my son, my daughter. Are we bringing the gospel into the way that we parent, or are we provoking, discouraging our children? So parents, don't provoke, don't discourage your children. Rather, your role is to encourage. Encourage your children to love them. And this takes a number of things. Most of all, it takes the Holy Spirit of God. That's the blank we have in your outline. It is so difficult to overcome our own sin and our own baggage, and we need the Holy Spirit to do this. But it also takes knowing your kids, knowing who they are, having conversations with them, asking good questions. If you're parents of teenagers, if you can master the art of the well-designed question instead of always giving answers, that will go a long way. It takes knowing how your kids are different from one another. I have a little girl. She's 5 months old-ish, and so we only have one, and I don't really have to deal with that, but I know for those of you who have multiple kids, right, your kids are different. You have to know how to parent one versus how the other is going to respond to that sort of comment or that sort of rule, right? You have to know your kids. It takes saying I love you to your children, even if your dad never told you that he loved you. Even if your mom never said those words, I love you. It takes doing that. It takes hugging your kids, caring for them. And like I said, it takes the Holy Spirit of God. When I was in junior high and high school, I played the bass clarinet. And for those of you who don't know what the bass clarinet is, it's this wonky-looking thing that is like a clarinet trying to pretend to be a saxophone, okay? It's like a big clarinet, and it's got a silver bell and kind of a, thing coming up top. And so I played the bass clarinet. It's a low woodwind. And if you know anything about low woodwinds, is they have like super boring parts. And so most of the parts for the bass clarinet were bum, 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 right? No matter what we were playing. Or just kind of like a long sustained bah, kind of thing. And there I was, just blowing proudly. Everybody else got to do fun stuff. And we all had sheet music, right? And we have a conductor that's telling us how to play our parts and helping coach us to do that well. And if everybody plays their part, if everybody does what's written in front of them, then it ends up sounding beautiful, even though the bass clarinet is not the most desirous instrument. If you've ever played for a sports team, if you've ever acted, if you've ever sung in a choir, you get this. Everybody has a part to play. We're all trying to follow our leader, and everybody's got a part to play in order to accomplish the goal that we're trying to accomplish. And it's the same thing in our families. That God has given husbands, he's given you a role. Wives, he's given you a role in your family. Children, God's given you a role in your family. Parents, he's given you a role in your family. And so when we listen to Jesus, our Lord, right, our head, our ruler, when we listen to him and submit to him, then we all are playing our part, and it ends up being this beautiful thing, and it ends up being a blessing. This reciprocal relationships ends up being a blessing in our own lives. And so if you've never done that, you've never submitted to Jesus, maybe you're still checking out this whole Christianity thing, I would just encourage you to investigate who Jesus is, what he said, what he did, and that he brings life and he is worth submitting everything to. It just takes a simple conversation with him saying, Jesus, I'm sick of running my own life. I'm sick of doing things my own way. It's gotten me nowhere so far, and I want to submit to you. I need you to forgive me for the things that I've done wrong. I need you to forgive me. I want you to come and be a part of my life. Rule my life. And if you do that, I can promise you that things will change. Now, it's not a magic Swiffer wipe that cleans up your relationships in an instant. But when we submit to Jesus as Lord, and when people in our family, everybody is submitting to Jesus as Lord, all of our other relationships sort of fall into place.